Okay, excellent. Well, again, thanks for the invitation. I saw that you guys work a lot with climate, and some of them maybe with carbon modeling. I'm not sure, but anyways, I decided to try to link up the concepts of defaunation, so basically the loss of animal populations. Some of them can be locally extinct and so on, but that doesn't mean that they have to be globally extinct. We're talking about declines in vertebrate abundance and so on, and how this can be linked to carbon stocks and the carbon cycle. And I'm going to start by, let me see if this works, showing you this footage of a neotropical forest in the western Brazilian Amazon. These are some neotropical primates, howler monkeys, woolly monkeys, spider monkeys, and a toucan, feeding on different fruit resources. And this is footage of another forest, not so far away from the other one, but when we see a different picture now, we see that the animals are gone. There's only small monkey there, pole feeding, and some of the fruits are left intact. So this kind of link to the concept of the empty forest, which is basically a term that was coined by Redford some years ago. It relates to the fact that we can have this kind of very intact, apparently undisturbed tropical forests, but that can be actually empty, devoid of animal populations because of overhunting and overexploitation. And this is still very difficult to quantify and track because we cannot use remote sensing to actually see what's going on under the canopy. And this area here actually is where we are conducting fieldwork, and the footage that you just saw come from this area. Is a very intact forest with a more remote part, which is still teeming with wildlife, but another area, which is the other slide with not so many animals, that is defaunated. We see that some mammal populations, some bird populations are gone. So how can we quantify this? This is something I've been doing in the past decade. For doing this, basically I relied on the central place foraging hypothesis, which states that humans are mostly central place foragers. We train to gather resources close to the places where we live. And in the case of local communities and rural communities in the tropics, they basically go into the forest, hunt. They can go a bit farther away and extract more wildlife resources, but then at some point they will return home. That means that we can have these non-hunted forests where we can see still intact communities, but they are farther away from the settlements where these hunters live. So this means that we can use distance to settlements or to roads, to any hunter's access point. We can use it as a proxy of hunting pressure. And this is a bit the premise we use in this paper that I published some years ago, because I could not go, of course, nobody can go and monitor and track wildlife across the full tropics. What we did is to gather all the possible evidence from many different studies conducted by hundreds of researchers across the tropics, and that had all of them, they had a similar design. They were comparing wildlife abundance in hunted versus unhunted forests, and at different distances from hunters' access points. So then we calculated this effect size, the response ratio, which is very used in meta-analysis, which is just the mean abundance of each species in a hunted site compared to its mean abundance in a control or unhunted site. So when it's log transform, that means that when it's 0, there's no change in abundance, and then positive values indicate an increase, and negative values a decrease. So we did some meta-analytical magic, and then we we have this distribution of effect sizes, of response ratios for each pairwise comparison between hunted and unhunted site for each species across all locations that you saw in the previous map. And in green, what you see is some species that have their populations increasing in hunted areas, maybe because they're not targeted or because they actually thrive, because there may be small site species that when the predators and competitors are gone, they become very abundant. But in most cases, most of the species have clear declines in their abundance, and some of them are locally extirpated, which is what we see here. So overall, when we back transform our response ratios to a normal scale, what we estimate is that in hunted areas, there's a decline in abundance of 58 to 83% in bird and mammal populations. We also wanted to see if we could find this relationship with human accessibility, and we did this for two main predictors. First, we check for the distance to hunters' access points, which was our main premise. And what you see here is, again, the response ratio. 0 is not change in abundance. And the size of the points, you see that they are different size. They indicate the precision of the estimates that were included in the models. So overall, what we estimate is that bird populations and mammal populations are depleted within the first 7 to 40 kilometers from hunters' access points. And then we also looked if we could find a relationship with basically travel time to any major city. So a city over 50,000 inhabitants, so not a rural settlement, but a city where the wild meat and the wild product could be commercialized. So basically, we're not looking only at whether subsistence hunting has an effect, so hunting for own consumption, but also if hunters decide to commercialize their products. And indeed, again, we found a clear effect of areas closer to these major cities having more depleted populations of birds and mammals. Okay, so this is nice. What we know more or less what's going on in hunted sites, but how is this? How these spatial patterns of defaunation can be mapped across the tropics. And again, we can use remote sensing to detect areas of intact forest where we can see an undisturbed canopy, and then areas, these red areas, where we can see these kind of processes, like habitat fragmentation, agricultural expansion, fires, and so on. But what's going on here? Is this area really intact or not? So here, because we knew our previous analysis were kind of working, we decided to expand our data set, which is what we did here. We expanded for mammals and birds. And then we applied a new set of models, Bayesian herd models, where we model, on the one hand, the probability of local extinction and the changes in abundance, and then with a series of predictors, not only one or two, but more. So we had here like the distance to hunters' access points and travel time, but also human population density. We had poverty levels. We had also net primary productivity of the forest, a series of predictors that we knew could more or less modulate hunting pressure or the reliance of local communities on wild meat. We also included some species traits because we know that usually the large size species are more targeted by hunters, although this can change for birds, because some birds, like small size passerines, are also very much appreciated as cage birds, for example, in Indonesia and Southeast Asia and so on, and also in some areas of Brazil. So we did all this, and then, of course, we ran our predictive performance analysis. But then we predict our models to each of the species of mammals and birds in the tropics. So we have these species-specific defaunation maps for each of the species, and when we stack them together, we can have per grid cell an index of defaunation for the mammal or the bird community. So this is what we did at first for mammals some years ago. We have this index going from 0 to 1, from finally intact to a fully defaunated area. And overall, when we cross it across all the species, which is around 3,000 species in the tropics for mammals, we have many areas that are kind of blue. So that means that there's no defaunation, and some spots where we see that there's something going on. So all this area here with different levels of defaunation is around 40% of the pantropical forest area. But the picture changes a lot when we split these results by body size. Because what's happening is that most of the mammal species are of this size. They are small-sized species which are not targeted by hunters, or they sometimes become overabundant in hunted areas when they're released from competition and predation. So when you average out everything, of course, these guys are bringing your index up. And the picture changes a lot for these medium-sized to large-sized species, which are actually targeted, which have slow reproductive rates, and which, under similar hunting pressure, they can have their population pretty much depleted across 60 or 80% of the forest area. After this, I thought, okay, now we have defaunation maps. Are those intact forests that we can see from remote sensing, are they actually intact or not? So what I did is just to overlap these maps with other maps of the Human Footprint Project. I don't know if you know it, but basically we took areas with no or low human footprint, but also those intact forest landscapes that were detected by remote sensing. And here on the right, what you see is in red areas that are supposed to be intact according to each of these two approaches, but according to our models, they could be defaunated, mostly for large-sized species. And this could be between 50 to 60% of the intact forest area. So this is where we came up with the concept of, okay, it's intact but empty forests. They are not really that intact. They could be empty because the animal communities are lost. So is this happening also with birds? Well, indeed, this is something we did more recently, a couple of years back. Impacts here are a bit smaller, so we don't have that high defaunation levels as in the case of mammals, and we have a slightly smaller extent of the pantropical forest area affected. But what is interesting here is that when we put the bird defaunation and the mammal defaunation maps together, we can see converging and divergent patterns. So for example, here in black or very dark purple, these are areas where both mammal defaunation levels and avian defaunation levels are very high. That means that the mammal and bird populations are quite depleted. And we can see this in the Atlantic forest, we can see this in the Mesoamerican corridor, in some parts of China, West Africa, and so on. But there are certain areas around the world where it's mostly birds, for example, here in Indonesia and Southeast Asia, some areas here in the Chaco, Caribbean islands, and so on, which is mostly bird populations which are being affected. And then there are some areas where it's mostly mammal populations, which is, for example, here, we're in the Horn of Africa, and then Mozambique, and the south part of the Amazon basin, closer with the Chaco. So when we put everything together, instead of having 50% of the pantropical forest area being, according to our models, defaunated, these numbers could go up, and then we would have like almost 80% of the pantropical forest zone with mammal or bird populations, or both, which are reduced to what we would call an intact community levels. So I'm moving now to another section of the talk, because we know that defaunation is not only caused by hunting or overexploitation, But if you look at here, there's another major driver, which is what most people focus on, well, especially in the tropics, which is deforestation, habitat loss, habitat degradation, and so on. There are works that indicate that around 80% of tropical forests could have low to medium integrity. And then we know from the work of my team that we could have between 50 to 80% of tropical forests under risk of hunting-induced defaunation. So how do we mix these both drivers and try to quantify what are the implications of this for species ranges and distributions, for extinction risk, for total biomass, and also for community structure? So I'm going to present some work we have done in the past years with some collaborators. First one is with Juan Gallego Zamorano. This work we did it some years ago when I was still in the Netherlands working. And here indeed we combine the impacts of land use change, hunting, the overlap of both of them, and what this means for area loss, species range area loss, when we combine everything together. And then we see a clear pattern. We see that it's mostly this very small to small size species are mostly affected by habitat loss. And then again, as it happens in the previous slides, which I show you, that is mostly medium and large size species being affected, hunting impacts start to take a toll on the distribution and range contractions of mammals only when they have a certain body size. And what is interesting here is that when we combine both effects, the percentage of area loss can be much higher than if we look at them separately, only when we focus on their overlap. And overall, what we estimate is that species range size is reduced by 40% on average because of the effects of both drivers. This is another work that we conducted in the Gran Chaco together with Alfredo. He did his PhD in this area. He's from Bolivia, so it's country over here. And the Gran Chaco is a very nice case study because it's a frontier forest where there's a rampant deforestation driven by cattle ranching, soybean expansion, and there's also retaliatory killing of jaguars because they attack the cattle, but there's also subsistence hunting. So Alfredo came to me to see how we could integrate my models into this analysis he was conducting. And this is the Chaco in the 1985, and this is how it has changed. Sorry, I didn't change the year here, but it's 2025. And in yellow, what would you see is basically anthropogenic land use expanding. So what we did is to combine habitat suitability models for almost 50 mammals living in the Chaco together with my hunting pressure models. And then we projected this for these 2 points in time to quantify where we could see areas where hunting pressure, poor habitat were affecting mammal species, which are the purple areas, and then some areas where it was one or the other driver affecting. So that was in blue, poor habitat, so habitat loss or habitat of lower quality because of anthropogenic conversion, or areas with high hunting pressure. And then we see especially in Paraguay, which is this area where there was hunting pressure in the past, but now there's been a major expansion of cattle ranching and land conversion, which has made this area way more purple. In general, what we estimate is that the footprint of both pressures have increased and expanded and now cover 40% of the entire Chaco. And this is not affecting all species equally. We see that there are some, the armadillos, for example, they are mostly being affected by an increasing hunting pressure, and that there are other species, mostly the big cats, so the puma, the jaguar, but also the ungulates or the peccaries, which are affected by both habitat destruction and hunting pressure. And again, the changes are mostly in one of the countries, in Paraguay, and this is because what we think is that in Argentina, most of the conversion, the habitat conversion, happened before the last decade. Okay, so this is another case study here. This was done with Giordano Mancini more recently, and here we wanted to see the synergistic effects of habitat fragmentation on hunting, on the extinction risk of tropical primates. And what you see on the left is extinction risk, which is higher when there's less area of habitat left. So basically, there's habitat loss. It's also higher when the defaunation index increases, so more hunting pressure. And also higher when there's not only habitat loss, but the area of the habitat left, so the fragments become smaller and smaller. And the main takeaway here is that the combination of habitat fragmentation and hunting pressure can have synergistic effects on extinction risk, which is what we see here. So extinction risk is higher with more fragmentation than with low fragmentation. But when the hunting pressure is low, there's barely any difference between areas that are very fragmented or not. And these effects only become evident as hunting pressure increases. So we have these synergistic effects which are acting together and basically pushing the extinction risks of non-tropical primates in a multiplicative instead of an additive way. Okay, and now I'm going to move to one of our last works that we're conducting in the lab. This is pretty brand new, it's not published yet. And this has been done with my PhD, Iago Ferreira. And it's an idea that, I had several years ago, and I discussed it with him. And he has done a very nice work pulling this together. So here we don't want to focus only on distribution changes or extinction risk. We want to see how much biomass, we're losing, how much of the carbon stocks that are stored in animal tissue is being lost, and how this has been lost throughout the years, especially since the onset of the Holocene. So after the Pleistocene extinctions of the larger mammal species that are no longer with us. So basically what has happened with everything that was remaining, and how habitat destruction and hunting has changed biomass patterns. So here we did a combination of different models that we had developed in the past years, together with information from different sources. And we start with the species ranges for a baseline scenario, so a historical distribution where there are no human impacts. And then we use a defaunation scenario where we focus on the current distribution of species ranges. And then what we did is to calculate the fraction of suitable habitat within the range for each of the mammal species under a map of potential natural vegetation, again, no human impacts, no habitat loss, for the baseline scenario. And for the defaunation scenario, we focus on the current distribution of habitats, which takes into account anthropogenic land cover changes and so on. And then we use another set of models from another collaborator I have, which model population densities and predict population densities across the ranges. So we can have an idea of how population density change in a baseline scenario with no habitat conversion, and in a defaunation scenario where there's been habitat conversion. And here we included in the defaunation scenario the hunting pressure models to account for overexploitation as well. So then in the end, we have, for each mammal species in the tropics, an abundance value for a baseline non-defaunated, human-free, let's put it like that, scenario. and then for a definitive scenario. When we combine for each of these the abundance estimates with their body mass, what we have is an estimate of how much biomass we have per species, but also when we stack them across the whole mammal community. So we have a total baseline biomass with no human impacts and a total defaunted biomass. So what we estimate is the following. We estimate that in the baseline scenario, like just before colonial times, just before we converted all habitats, and before overexploitation was like a major driver of vertebrate abundances loss. We have a biomass of around 120 megatons of mammals. But in the definitive scenario, this huge box of biomass, this stock, has been reduced by almost 50%. So half of the mammalian biomass has been lost since the onset of the Holocene. And not only that, we have seen a shift in the community and the structure of the mammal communities. What you see here is the body mass distribution for the baseline in blue. This is how distribution of body masses was in the past, and how it has shifted towards nowadays values. And these are about around 60% change. So we see that mammal communities are becoming smaller in general. We are shifting towards small size species dominating the community. And this is very clear when we split the results by mammalian orders. So basically losing the elephants, not the species per se, but basically what the two species that are left, their abundances are being reduced so much and the range size is so much that the amount of biomass they accounted for in the past has now been lost by 80%. Something similar is happening with the rhinos and the ungulates. And with other orders, or not that dramatic. And what is really striking here is that rodents, they actually have a biomass increase. They are kind of becoming more abundant. Now the share of the total biomass of mammals is becoming larger. The problem is that they're not really compensating with the full biomass or the whole biomass we had in the past. So what's going on spatially? So in the baseline, what we used to have is this clear pattern of having more mammalian biomass in the Afrotropical and the Indo-Malayan realm, and less in the Neotropical realm. And this was because after the colonization of the Americas by humans, hunter-gatherers, some 14,000 years ago, there was a huge wave of extinctions going on. So much of the large mammals disappeared, the giant ground sloths and so on. And there were only like large mammals left in the Neotropics and in the Malayan realm. But nowadays, after habitat conversion and overexploitation, we see that these patterns are becoming more homogeneous across the full tropics. We see that the spatial distribution of biomass is homogenizing across the tropics. Right, so to recap here, we're seeing that we are having a net loss in the amount of biomass, in the amount of carbon that is stored in mammals, and that is shifting from long-lived, large-size animals to short-lived, small-size animals like rodents. But there are more implications than only this for carbon stocks. These animals we're losing, many of them have very important functions in the ecosystems. And in the tropics, many of them depend on food resources for the diet, which is something we have seen in the first slides when I show you the footage. They were mostly large primates feeding on fruits. And what is really important here is that most of the tropical plant species in the neotropics and afrotropics, 90 to 80%, depend on animals for dispersing their seeds, for recruiting new plant species, sorry, not the species, new individuals, and basically for forest regeneration. These numbers are a bit lower in Asia because you have a big bunch of wind-dispersed plant species there, the Dipterocarpaceae family mostly. Okay, we also know that it's mostly the large primates, the large toucans, the tapirs, and so on, that are able to feed on big fruits with huge or large seeds and able to disperse these seeds. And normally these correspond to trees with high wood density and which are able to store more carbon. So another large part of my recent research is focused on these consequences of defaunation for these processes. So we could expect that from an initial community to another one where most of the large body frugivores are lost, that there could be a shift in the composition of tropical forests, first from animal dispersed to wind dispersed species, and then also from large seeded animal dispersed plant species to small seeded plant species. So because as I mentioned, these large seeded plant species normally they store more carbon, we could also expect changes in the ability of tropical forests to store carbon. And this is really, really important because, as you know, tropical forests are one of the major reservoirs of carbon among all forests in the world. Basically, 50% of all carbon stored in forest biomass is in tropical forest. So, as I said, we're not only losing carbon stored in animal tissue, but also we may be losing the ability of this tropical forest to store carbon because the animals allowing forest regeneration may be disappearing. So here, this is something that a good collaborator of mine has been looking into in the Medio-Juruá region where we work in the Brazilian Amazon. And here, the first thing she did is to quantify how much biomass in mammals is left across 30 sites with a different hunting pressure. And there what she saw is that indeed you have a loss of grazers and frugivores across the whole hunting pressure gradient, with the small mammals becoming more overabundant. This is something that we have seen in the talk already. So in the next chapter of her thesis, we collaborated to see whether this was having consequences for the recruitment of plant species. And here we looked at seedling recruitment, so juvenile recruitment, basically by calculating the ratio of saplings to adults. And this should be around 0 if saplings are recruiting according to the composition of adults in each vegetation plot. But this is not the case when we see the seed size of the different plant species that are recruiting. So indeed, for small seeded or medium seeded plant species, they are able to recruit in relation to the composition of adults. But we see that recruitment is being impaired mostly for the large seeded plant species. So indeed, these patterns of defaunation of less mammalian biomass is having consequences also for the recruitment of large seeded plant species. But this is for a region in the tropics. What's happening across the tropics? Can we see the similar patterns? This is some work that I've been working already for many years because it's quite an effort to gather all this information, but basically I'm retrieving information on fruit removal, seed density, secondary dispersal, seedling establishment in defaunated and non-defaunated forests across the world, and seeing where we can see a signal of defaunation on the recruitment patterns of different plant species. And overall, this is still very preliminary, what we see is there's a 42%, 70% decline in each of the different stages of the seed dispersal cycle. And indeed, when we look at the differences in the seed size of plant species that are being recruited, we will see here again the size of the points reflects the precision of the estimate. What we see is that there's a little decline for those large seeded plant species which are unable to recruit as well as other species. Still, it's very noisy, but we still see there the signal. So is this affecting the carbon capacity of forests? And this is still a question that some people have looked in different plots across the tropics, but we are still far for a generalizable quantification of reductions in carbon stocks. But in a recent review, we gather all this information together with Jedediah Brody and others for different studies across the tropics. And then we see that carbon storage can be reduced up to 26%, mostly in the neo and afrotropics, but not so much on the Indo-Malayan forests. Maybe because, as I said, here there's a larger composition of wind-dispersed plant species. We're not sure about it, but these are still first estimates, and there's very little evidence about this, and this is something that we are trying to gather more evidence as the years progress. Okay, so at this point of the talk, we've seen what the concept of INTA2, but empty forest is, how we can quantify defaunation, that it has consequences for carbon stocks, both in animal tissues, but also in tropical forests. And what can we do about it, right? So this is something we have been working on recently with Martin Philippe. He's a postdoc in my lab. And here we were focusing on the Global Biodiversity Framework targets, especially on target 3, which states that we should protect up to 30% of the Earth, of the planet, of the land of the Earth by 2030, and maybe 50 by 2050. Well, the target now is 30 by 30. So we did normally this spatial prioritization analysis, or where we should allocate conservation actions for protection. It could be strict protected areas, but it could be community-based forests or other actions that are necessary. So these are kind of analyses have normally focused only on land conversion, habitat loss, and so on. And this is the first time that we focus mostly on areas where there are mammal and bird communities that are vulnerable to hunting. I'm not going to go into the details of how we derived this vulnerability index. There are a couple of preprints about it that you can check later. But basically, using this information, we can pinpoint areas in the Amazonia, the Congo Basin, and Borneo and New Guinea, where we should implement conservation actions. In dark blue, what you see is the current network of protected areas. So for example, there are 2 here, another one here, and so on. And there in lighter blue, where they should be expanded, or there should be another conservation actions implemented. And here below, what you see is that what protecting this amount of land would entail for, in this case, for threatened mammals and birds. I want you to focus on the orange line. And we see that if we are able to protect up to 30% of the land in the tropics, that would bring up to 60% or 62% of mammal species out of a threatened category. And then if we keep on increasing the amount of land protected, we could end up having like almost 90% of the mammal and bird species outside of a threatened status. Okay, but we know that on the one hand, there's people living in tropical forests, and also there are other indices that we should use for spatial prioritization. So here on the left, what we did is, okay, let's check how much of the land that we say that should be protected because of mammal communities that are vulnerable to hunting, how much of this land overlap with forests that have high integrity. So we can have a win-win situation. And then forest integrity in this case was measured more about, again, the structure of the forest and more about how intact they look, not about defaunation. But here we see that there are some overlaps. No? In red, we see areas which are high integrity forests, but also areas where we indicate that there should be a priority for conservation because of the hunting vulnerable communities that live there. And then on the right, what we look is how much of these priority areas overlap with indigenous lands. Basically, knowing that sometimes these are the main stewards of biodiversity conservation, and we cannot, of course, impose expanding protected areas into their lands. But basically, if we have an overlap between our priority areas, indigenous lands, the idea would be to focus conservation into community-based forest management and leave them be, and then have another areas where maybe there's a less percentage of land that is covered by indigenous land territories where we should prioritize other kinds of actions. So with this, I'm going to wrap up with some take-home messages. What we have seen in the talk is that Defaunation scales up from a species to the carbon cycle. It's kind of an invisible process. With remote sensing, we cannot really track it, and we cannot assume that forest cover or similarly undisturbed forest canopy is equal to intactness, because intact forest can be empty. Then we have seen that there might be synergistic and combined effects of habitat loss and hunting. In the sense of mammalian biomass, they have acted in concert to decrease the mammalian biomass by half since the onset of the Holocene. Then we see that Defaunation has cascading effects from body size to tree communities and to forest carbon stocks, with shifts in community body mass distributions, shift towards more rodents becoming predominant in mammal communities, and impaired recruitment of plant species and potentially lower carbon stocks. And finally, I have tried to focus on some positive sides, so basically where we can establish actions to basically protect hunting vulnerable communities and establish effective and just conservation actions. And overall, I would like to, this is not something that I'm the only one saying. This is something that in the community or other researchers working in this area, they have already mentioned, but basically we have to start also integrating animal dynamics into carbon cycle models if we want to better account for climate change impacts or mitigation in the near future. I want to thank my collaborators and funders. With that, I will be happy to take your questions.
Yeah, thank you, Annette, for the wonderful talk and the information.
I think I went a bit over the time. I'm sorry about that.
Okay, so question?
Yes.
Thank you very much for sharing these amazing results with us, Anna. I have a few questions. Maybe I'll start with a simple one. First, right now, you have focused more on the anthropogenic, on-the-ground effects on mammals or animals in general. But we also have the climate change effect to consider. And people have looked at the impact of climate change on mammalian habitats and so on. Are you planning to integrate these together? Because you pointed out the synergistic effect from hunting pressure and habitat loss. On top of this, there could be another amplifying or compounding factor from climate change on habitats. Is that something that you're planning to study further?
Yeah, thanks a lot for the question, Axel. Yeah, indeed. This is something that we've been working on with some people from Sheffield. Now they moved to Cambridge, but yeah, it's the same people. To basically accounting for climate change and then see how some mammals may shift their species, sorry, the species, not their ranges, their distributions because of increases in temperature or changes in precipitation, and how in some cases populations or areas of the range that could be, like safe from hunting pressure because of they have to shift tracking climatic conditions, they could be put more at risk of hunting pressure. So do you know what I mean?
Yes.
So it's basically looking at that. But it's not only that, there are also other ideas. So basically, because of this interdependence between animals and plant species, mostly for recruitment of new juveniles, you could see that some plant species may not be able to track climatic conditions because maybe the animals are moving, and they're no longer overlapping with the range to be able to basically consume the fruits and disperse the disease to recruit the new juveniles. So there are different angles that can be looked at. And this one I haven't explored much yet, the second one I told you, but it's something that is, of course, in the back of my head. There's so much that one can do in 24 hours a day.
That's right. So another question refers to keystone species, and we're also working on keystone species in our center a little bit. I mean, there are different conservation strategies. One is to say, okay, an entire area will become, let's say, a conservation site. Or one can say we protect only particular species that are extremely relevant for the ecosystems that may have been hunted before, and that you put a kind of a stop on hunting activities on keystone species. Is that something that people are considering? Is it something that has been quantified statistically or numerically?
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
efficiency of the approach?
Yeah. So indeed, mostly, I mean, again, with the same ecosystem function as seed dispersals, of course, all the frugivores are not equally effective as dispersing the seeds because some of them are able to ingest, distribute and disperse a larger amount of seeds than others. And they're also able to move them at longer distances, which increases the chances of plant recruitment because of Janssen-Conel effects and so on. So what we see is that it's normally the large frugivores, those that we're losing, the ones that are, don't want to use the term keystone, but let's say that they're very relevant in this whole process, no? And there has been studies, I would say in the Atlantic forest mostly, where they have way more habitat fragmentation and overexploitation and of course more defaunation, where they have reintroduced, I want to say tapir in some areas, and then some toucan, larger body toucan. They are kind of tracking how much this has basically restored plant-animal interactions. And in the future, of course, they will have to look at seedling recruitment and so on. But the idea is that basically to restore the function. So how by basically putting again one of these key species back in the system, how this can kind of restore some of the ecosystem functions that were going on. In the work we're doing in the Brazilian Amazon, which is a more pristine area, although there are still signs of defaunation, we're also now looking at plant-animal interactions using arboreal camera trapping and ground camera trapping. And we are trying also to understand how the structure of this network changed, but also how the role of different animals changed or is lost, and where this can be taken over by another species. And we are still working on this, but there are basically some shifts that we're not really sure that they are fully compensating for the loss of some of the species like these large woolly monkeys, the lagotrix, or the spider monkeys, which disperse I don't know how many seeds per day.
Thanks a lot, Anna. Interesting.
Thanks a lot.
Okay. I have a question. So you told about habitat fragmentation and hunting shown in a figure. So how will you separate out the effect of hunting and habitat fragmentation? Because a fragmented
You're breaking a bit to Shara. It's like
okay. So
maybe
how do you separate out the effect of habitat fragmentation and hunting?
how you
Because
separate it.
yeah,
That's what you
because
mean.
both are connected, right?
Yeah, they're kind of connected, but in the first works that I presented, the idea was to basically only gather information from studies where basically the researchers are comparing continuous forests or forests with similar environmental conditions in terms of forest cover and so on, but with the only difference being hunting pressure. So because there are other studies where you have several study sites, and one of them is, I don't know, fragmented and hunted, and the other one is secondary forest and hunted, and then there's a primary forest and hunted, and then primary forest and hunted. Sorry, non-hunted. So basically, you can only compare where you have primary forest, non-hunted versus hunted, but not the secondary forests or the other one, which is kind of fragmented, because otherwise you start to have confounding effects. So the first idea was to, okay, let's have a working model of impacts of hunting pressure on vertebrate populations, and then later see how we can combine this with another approach with changes in land use and so on. Ideally, it would be nice to have way more studies looking directly at synergistic effects and having where you can have all kinds of pairwise comparisons to, I think, more properly, not only separate, but also account better for the synergistic effects. Because now when we combine our hunting pressure models with land use change and changes in species distributions, in most of the cases we see overlaps and then additive effects, but the only time that we have been able to have some kind of synergy was with the tropical primates study, where we could have these interactive effects in the model, and then we could see this how at different levels of hunting pressure or defaunation index in this case, the effect of fragmentation would shift. I don't know if that kind of answer your question.
Okay. Yeah.
Actually, I have one more question. Sorry.
No, yeah, sure.
In Korea, the forest situation is very strange. We have 70 or 80% forest coverage here, and the forests are empty. There is no top predator anymore. There is very little hunting pressure. So it's a bit mysterious why these forests are empty. And the idea maybe was proposed or suggested that maybe air pollution also plays an important role because Korea is essentially downstream of the big air pollution plume from China. And of course, when we have days of strong air pollution, we go out, we wear a mask. Still, it's a major effect. So I can imagine that many other animals with maybe faster metabolism and so on may be much more affected actually by air pollution. So I'm wondering if you are aware of any studies where either physiological studies or maybe statistical meta-population studies where people have identified or looked at the effect of air pollution on, let's say, general bird or mammal or any animal.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry, I interrupted you. No, I mean, of course, it's not my focus. I don't do research on this topic. With pollution, we have, or I am aware of a study looking at light pollution. and sometimes plastic pollution, but not air per se. Air pollution or like other contaminants in the air. So I couldn't answer your question in this sense, but I'm gonna have another questions for you. So you say that you have 70 to 80% of forest cover, but how is this forest looking? Are we talking about primary forest? Is it secondary forest?
I think
Is it
secondary.
patchy? It's secondary forest, and then the other thing is that maybe what you see here is just a reflection of what happened in the past. So I think South Korea is a very developed country. I don't think that people are hunting for subsistence or even to commercialize the meat anywhere else. And this is also one of the reasons why it's not included in my models, because what I'm trying to model here is some dynamics that are mostly happening in the tropics, where people are really still reliant on wild products. But this is not something that we can apply to developed countries or to the global north and so on. But it could very well happen that all those animals they're talking about were long ago extirpated because of hunting pressure, and they never came back because probably there are way too many people.
Many people live in the big
over there.
cities. The rest of the country is pretty empty. Of course, there are streets, but they also have wild tunnels and so on. I think the interesting aspect is there is no top predator anymore.
Yeah.
Yet you have some deers, you have some rabbits running around, but given the amount of forest coverage and food resources available, these forests should be exploding essentially with mammals. And that's absolutely not the case. I mean, I know that Germany has 20% forest coverage, and you see dead animals on the road all the time. So it's a bit mysterious. So, anyways, the air pollution thing
it could be interesting.
Only something that people have not really fully considered.
Yeah, it could be. I don't know. I'm really not aware at all of the South Korea
I
case.
just wanted to say big thank you from all of us. But also, since we are also working on this nexus between climate and life, we built a mammal model. We have coupled this to a vegetation model exactly to simulate quantitatively the aspects that you are discussing. If you would like any of us to give presentations also to your team, let us. We would be happy to have a reciprocal exchange here of ideas and perspectives.
Yeah, for sure. That would be great. We also hold lab seminars every 2 Thursdays. Actually, we have one today later. So I would be happy if any of you want to present their work in one of our group meetings. The only issue we will have to see about the time, because of course we have a big time difference, but maybe we can make it work at 9 o'clock here, 4 o'clock there. That could be awesome.
Absolutely. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks a lot again. Yeah. Good luck with the seminar series.
Thank you, Anna.
Ciao.
Thank you, Anna.
Bye.
Thank you for the yeah. Okay. So see you soon.
See you. Ciao.
Ciao.